Hi everyone, this is Setu from PAMA. Greetings to all. On behalf of PAMA, I welcome all of you to this inaugural session of PAMA Global Discourse. We are pleased to have Dr. Irving Finkel with us, the legendary archaeologist and author from British Museum, London, for inaugurating this discourse. Today, Dr. Finkel will be addressing the question of why archaeology, followed by a discussion if needed. So those who wish to raise questions can do that in the comment section, and we will be bringing those questions to the speaker's attention. And during the talk, we request all of the participants to turn off your mic for the smooth conduct of the talk. Being said this much, I welcome Dr. P.J. Cherian, Director of the PAMA Institute of Archaeological Sciences, on screen to share a brief introduction on the PAMA Global Discourse and to welcome Dr. Finkel for the talk.
Good evening. Am I visible?
Yes, to me, yes.
Yes, sir.
Happily so.
Okay. Yeah. It's a hello, Finkel.
Hello, sir. Hello.
Yeah. So my responsibility is to welcome all of you to this global event in a way when the world is really shaken and frightened about a ghost that is going around and mostly invisible. I begin my introduction as Sedu requested, welcoming dear friend and patron Dr. Irving Finkel, dear PAMA Chairman Professor RBG Menon, our patrons, trustees of this non-profit research platform PAMA, her friends, researchers, interns, and collaborating as Sedu mentioned, this is a great privilege to welcome you all from a little coastal village on the southwestern coast of the Indian subcontinent, presently known as Kerala, and the village is called Pattanam. Earlier it was probably Muchiripattinam, and the non-locals called it Musiris. My colleagues and students requested me to say a couple of words on PAMA Research Institute. PAMA is a 3-year-old infant born in very special circumstances as a third sector public initiative. We conceived it as a multidisciplinary, cross-disciplinary, or transdisciplinary collective of academics, professionals from probably all conceivable knowledge domains to train students towards a more comprehensive, creative goal following rigorous investigative methods and procedures. We undertake guidance and execution of short-term and long-term research projects or proposals or activities. As the diversity of knowledge procedures demand, our research concerns vary in an infinite range. In other words, we promote integrative research aimed towards the understanding of the depth of nature and humanity. In this, we think archaeology could be an inevitable domain, and hence we call it a research institution of transdisciplinary sciences. The center started functioning at the globally important site of Pattanam, with the goal of continuing the multidisciplinary research that began in 2006 and aims to transform the site into a local community-centric World Heritage Site and an inclusive knowledge hub of all science-sensitive professionals across borders. Today, we are privileged to have the curator of British Museum and a world authority on Mesopotamian culture. He was the great privilege, additional privilege is that he visited Pattanam and he was with the students and the colleagues then working in KCHR. And while returning, he mentioned, Dr. Cherian, he whispered to me, I feel I am in a little heaven. I don't feel like returning. Ever since he was a sort of spirit that we used to depend on whenever we were doing various things here. You know, I always remind my students this work to begin with, to know how to develop yourself into a great researcher. What is the hard work behind it? What is the concentration behind it? What is the transdisciplinary approach behind it? So many of my students really go through it, and all the audience today, I wish you should go in great detail the ark before Noah. And it is a decoding exercise of retelling the story of Noah's flood story, probably 1,000 years before it appeared as a biblical story. So it was really a kind of a challenge to the established religions of the world and the kind of stories and legends they built, because he deciphered a clay tablet with wedges that tells the story of the great flood that actually submerged the entire globe. We don't know what COVID is going to do, but it is a great privilege that we have with us Dr. Finkel, who went into the nitty-gritty details, and while trying to make it a kind of a TV serial or a TV program, he came to Kerala actually to build the ancient boat that saved, and it was in the Punnamada Kayal of Alapi, with nobody, the Kerala public, ever knowing that he is here and he is creating one of the wonders of the world. And he had an elephant into that, and he acting as the ancient Noah or somebody like that. He moved through the Punnamada Kayal, and that was short, and that he was showing our students when he came last to Kerala. It was a great privilege to have been with him for nearly a week, and KCHR was then a co-host of him, and we have learned much from him. And to have this program started, when we thought of many names, we thought it is Dr. Irving Finkel, who wants to when we told that he should talk about archaeology and reimagining museums, that is entirely his kind of knowledge hunt that he was after. And you know, archaeology is a very marginal topic. It is given to some exclusive set of people who has to do it. And at this juncture, when the globe is facing such a crisis, I remember the words of Noam Chomsky, who said, if you want to save the world, get back to the feet of your ancestors and learn from them. You might save the world. So why archaeology is a question that will generate numerous questions, and also how we communicate. Museums are spaces that communicates, that illuminates, that excites, that curiosity, that we really want to know about that past that is so huge. And now genetics have come to our help to say and tell us we are not what we think. So it is a great privilege and honor to welcome Dr. Finkel to this collective, and for you it is afternoon, and for us it is evening, and to our friends in the Far East it is early morning. So with these words, I welcome Dr. Finkel to this evening discussion and kind of conversation we were looking for. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Acharya. So with great pleasure and privilege, I invite Dr. Finkel on screen. Sir, now the space is yours.
Dr. Cherian, thank you for your wonderful introduction. I'm very glad to be back in the little paradise, even if it's only in this strange form. So, I'm going to talk to you about why archaeology. So this is a very general sounding topic. And in fact, if you think about it, it implies that we need to defend ourselves. And if we are archaeologists, I think we sometimes do need to defend ourselves. So this talk is going to be partly about how to justify what you do when someone says, you're an archaeologist, what's the point of that? And it's a mixture of cynical ideas and health warnings. So when you undertake life as a trainee student and you become an archaeologist, and that's what you do in your life, then you bump into the public very often. And you have to be forewarned, or you have to be strengthened, because on the whole, the public understanding of archaeology is very, very limited. So a lot of people think that when we go for an excavation, we are looking for gold and treasure and jewelry and skeletons and exciting things like that, just because it's exciting and also for us to become rich. Well, I'm afraid this is not true at all, as you know, and we don't always find gold. But the important thing is that the public in general think that's what we are doing. And it is certainly true that when there are popular accounts of archaeology in the newspapers or the cinema or in books, this side of things, the romantic struggle to find treasure in difficult places, is for most people consolidated as what archaeologists are really doing. So the thing is, this is the truth, that non-archaeologists don't have any idea at all of what we do. They have a very, very poor idea of it. And they have almost no idea that what we do is primarily scientific, and it utilizes up-to-date scientific techniques And in fact, it is a marvelous collaborative discipline in the pursuit of knowledge. But to people on the outside, we are eccentric people who waste our time for no real reason. Now, the other side of this situation is that we often have great trouble with funding, as Dr. Cherian will confirm, but this applies to archaeology everywhere. Governments, rich persons are very reluctant to put money into archaeology. They only just tolerate it. They don't think it's worthy of funding because what income does it bring back? Not very much. And what good does it do either? And this is the truth of the matter. If somebody thinks, well, what good does archaeology do? It is a very difficult thing to persuade them to listen to some good arguments, because if they ask that question, then they are, to some extent, a hopeless case. Of course, you can get them by the ears and pull their ears and make them listen. But generally speaking, if you are a student archaeologist or a young archaeologist or even a professional archaeologist, one of the realities of your life is you are surrounded by people who don't really understand what you're doing, and they don't really think it's worthwhile. Now, one really good argument, and I want to give you a few things to have in your hand so that when someone says to you some dismissive remark, you've got these things in your hand, you can pull one out and say, but wait. Now, the most effective one today in the modern world is heritage, because heritage is a very buzzy word indeed. And I don't know about India, but I can tell you in Britain and Europe and America, there are many people in the population who are obsessed with the word heritage, and for them that is the excuse for everything, and they have a special arrangement in the world called little boxes. And little boxes are specially designed by a cosmic designer so that when you're discussing heritage, you take your pencil and you put a tick in the box, and then everybody's happy. And when you have heritage on your side and a t-shirt saying, I work with heritage, people say, we understand it's to do with heritage. Now, the thing is, I reckon half the projects which are funded or supported for heritage are very flimsy. They are very short term and probably aren't all that valuable. But the thing about archaeology is it is absolutely heritage. Nobody can argue or wriggle out of the acknowledgement that this is heritage with a capital H, because it's stuff left in the ground by people who lived before us, for us to find, for us to look after, and for us to understand. So you can say we're archaeologists, people might yawn, but when you say I'm a heritage worker, I work in the heritage of culture, I'm an archaeologist, they'll all say, well, this is marvelous, this is just what we want to hear. So I'm a great believer in the right kind of t-shirt and the right kind of buzzword, not among archaeologists, because archaeologists know what buzzwords are, and they are mostly just buzz. But when you have to interact with people who are not archaeologists, then heritage is a very powerful weapon, and even people who have funds to give and people who are politicians, very important people, they understand this word, they know it's a good thing. So I think the word heritage is a very desirable asset for us. Now, when you undertake archaeological work as a student, a volunteer, as a professional, as a state archaeologist, whatever it will be, the work obviously forms certain different areas. The primary job is excavation. And this is a very marvelous discipline to work in. It's very exciting, not because of gold and skeletons, but because of the work itself. It is detective work and science and artistic understanding all at once. You're like a sculpture. A sculptor, you have the ground beneath your feet, and from it you bring out the life, you revive things, you sculpt them into their original shape, and you talk to them when you understand them. So when things are found, as you know better than me, there are post-excavation procedures. That's to say, conservation and restoration, and then publication. So if you find a palace full of skeletons that have been poisoned and all sorts of dramatic things like that, then the media cannot wait to come and interview you and have photographs on people's television screens, and all over the world people will know for 5 minutes about your work. Of course, after that they forget all about it. But if you haven't got these extraordinary things on your side, then journals and books and so forth are there as a tool. Plus, when I was a boy, of course, this didn't happen, and Professor Cherian will agree with me, but nowadays the resources of the internet are a great asset for archaeology. They are one of our best strong tools to disseminate information in the way that people can easily understand and find interesting. So if you are a young archaeologist or thinking of it, there are a few things. As an old archaeologist myself, and I'm going to be 70 quite soon, and when I say I'm an archaeologist, I'm actually a museum curator, and most people think that museum curators are no good at anything, but I am a museum curator, and I've been on excavations in different countries. I've been in trenches and had workmen and made discoveries and helped with the publication, so I have some experience of this world. And very fascinating it is to me too. But I'm primarily a reader of inscriptions, of ancient inscriptions from Iraq, Sumerian and Babylonian and things like that. So the thing is, and I remember reading a book by Sir Leonard Woolley when I was at school, that if you want to be an archaeologist, he said, you have to know everything about everything. And the corollary of this is that when you are an actual archaeologist actually digging, the more you know about every single thing there is to know, the better equipped you are. So you have to have your tools, just a trowel and a spade, of course, or much more sophisticated tools like that. Everybody has their tools, but one of the tools is a stuffed head full of as much technical, practical, realistic, historical, scientific and intellectual matter as you can get in through your nose and ears and eyes and keep it there. Because when you are an archaeologist in the middle of a dig with complicated stratigraphy and impatient workmen or helpful workmen or peaceful, and then it rains and then all these other things, it's like being a traffic policeman in the middle of a roundabout at the rush hour when everybody is going the wrong way and everybody's hooting their hoons, and you've got to sort everything out. And there you have to be tranquil and masterful and in charge, but also you have to have a brain where all the information that you need is neatly stored so you can just pull out the drawer and check. This is the theory. Second point I would make, that it's very easy to fall into the trap that when you have your excavation, you publish your dig report, you have the pottery drawn, you have the stratigraphy sorted out, there are photographs, graphs, plans, all the stuff you have to have in a proper dig report so that people know it's a proper dig report. It's easy to come up with the idea that the dig report is the end of the product. But in my idea, the dig report is the beginning of the real work, because a dig report has a terrifically important matter, which is its responsibility, because millions of people who will be interested over the millions of years to come will never have been in the trench with you, will never have seen the excavation. Photographs are good, and sometimes they're very good, but it's almost superhumanly impossible for somebody reading a book 75 years later in a library to get any idea at all of what this excavation was like. Even sometimes with cinefilm, it's very difficult to understand it in the way that you would if you were in the trench, in the excavation, doing the planning and so forth. So I think from my own experience of my real archaeological colleagues, there are some deplorable things to be said about dig reports. For example, most of them never get done. Lots of archaeologists die, and then their poor widows have a study full of notes, and some miserable PhD student is then given 5 years to sort out these notes and make a report for printing now. And that is a task of almost superhuman demand, because if you were never there, you can never understand really, really, truly. So it's an urgent thing that when you've done the work and you've got the book, publish the book, to save anybody else having to tread after you, and also to write the archaeological reports in the simplest, clearest way. See, I have something to say about this because I have to use archaeological reports. I'm not a real digger at all. I have to work with inscriptions that are found in buildings, found in rooms. They tie in with architecture. They are kind of all one mass, the buildings and the contents. But if you're a philologist like myself and you get a fat book off the shelf to read about the excavations, you don't know where you're coming or going. It's impossible to fathom. And the plans with dotted lines and black lines, they're all very well for professional colleagues, but it is important. So all dig reports should contain some kind of synthesis at the end of the excavation record about what, as a whole, the dig discovered, what it confirmed, what's new, what new work it throws up, where we should be going from here, why we want to go back and dig further. Don't leave all those things, shouldn't be implicit. They should be explicit. And it's very rare, because by the time you get to the end of an excavation report, they've done all the heavy stuff, and then you get the spindle whorls, and you get seals and amulets and small pieces, and they get smaller and smaller and smaller, and then the end, and that's the end of the book. And someone who wants to know, what does this dig tell us about the Bronze Age in, for example, Western Nepal or in southern Iraq? What, if you come to it just to get a kind of meal that you can digest, what do you get from it? And it's inscrutable and impossible to understand. And this is not a good thing, because it is off-putting to at least half the population who really want to understand these things. Next point. As a matter of being a writing and learned archaeologist, always check the information that you are referring to for yourself. Always go back to the original sources wherever you can. This is a very important rule, because otherwise what happens is this. We have experts. Experts make pronouncements. Pronouncements, after a while, when 2 or 3 people have the same pronouncement between them, we have a consensus. And once we have a consensus, we have dogma. So when you have the expert pronouncement, consensus, dogma rule, you have a closing in of new thought, and you have a shutdown on the idea of looking outwards. It all becomes like a nice finished thing that you can dust once a month and make it shiny and leave it there. But the further things go along the track from expert to dogma, the more distortion, the more inaccuracy, and the more fudging is intrinsic. Because what happens is this: with evidence, you might have one small piece of evidence here, and another small piece of evidence there, and a couple more over there. And when you look at those pieces of evidence, if your plan is to make a summary understanding of what we know on the basis of that evidence, that is fine. That is perfectly legitimate. In other words, this is a statement of understanding as we have it now, and understood, but never said. It might be wrong next weekend. It might be wrong in 5 years' time, and any kind of discovery can show that we were totally deluded by our desire to put everything together in a meaningful message. It's never safe. And what happens is this, that the primary publication level, the primary consideration that when we put this stuff together, as far as we can say today, this is what it means, that is only fine if it stops there. But when it becomes repeated and repeated and repeated, and each time the PhD thesis or the professional book reviewer or another scholar who starts from scratch regurgitates what was once a flimsy piece of thought into dogma, and it becomes fixed, and then it is the devil's own work to undo it. This is a commonplace of scholarship, and it is absolutely true of archaeology. Now, the writing of a synthesis at the end of a dig report, let alone a synthesis as a whole volume, so you wanted to write a book called The Mind of Ancient Man, or how did women deal with childbirth throughout the ages, and you try and get information from all the sorts of... If you write a synthesis like this, you get into hot water, because your colleagues who are too lazy to do it or too intimidated are resentful that you've done this, and they attack you for pandering to the public and watering things down and or low common denominator and all this kind of thing, whereas any synthesis is better than no synthesis, provided it is understood to be a synthesis as of the best we can do, not law forever afterwards. So because people sneer at synthetic writing and publications which try to cover a wide span, and because of the intrinsic danger of the breadth of it, people don't write any syntheses. Now, the thing is this is what the public need. If you want people to sponsor digs and be involved in archaeology and watch programs on television and read books and altogether be archaeological fans, then they have to have literature which is clear and interesting to them, not patronizing, not looking down on them, and not befuddling them with science. And there's a whole requirement for books for children and for adults of this kind. I don't know what happens now in India, but when I grew up, and I know for a long time, you have public libraries where school children, when they have homework, used to go and look at books in the public library. Now, I don't know whether that happens anymore. Probably all the kids look at everything on the internet and probably don't do any homework anyway. But the thing is, the principle is that the library book, to my mind, is a very wonderful conception as a guide to synthetic writing for archaeologists. So in other words, if you produce a book based on primarily your own work and your own experience, and you extrapolate from it with one or other vision in mind and other comparanda in mind until you've fleshed out something into what might become an introduction in general, that is the sort of market where you'd have it on a shelf in a public library, and any person off the street, so to speak, who was impelled to be interested could read that book with relish and appreciation. It's a very difficult thing to do, but it's a lamentable thing to me that syntheses in writing are despised by us, by colleagues, and they are hardly not pursued. I'll give you a very clear indication. Sometimes the British Museum has a publishing house, and sometimes a plucky or courageous school teacher or something writes a book of general type, say the Vikings, for example, without being a Viking scholar of this kind. And often they come to the British Museum for us to check. Now, this principle of checking requires a little moment's consideration, because when you check somebody else's manuscript, it is not ticking a box and sending it back. You have to read the damn thing. And when you've read the damn thing, you have to sort out what's wrong with the damn thing. And by the time you've sorted out what's wrong with the damn thing and then corrected it, you might as well have written the book yourself. This happens to curators in the British Museum regularly. But the British Museum does not promote us writing the sort of works that I think we should. So therefore, we have to clean up after other people who do it. And they are, people who write books in that way are on the wrong end of the pronouncement, consensus, dogma rule. By the time information comes to them, it's fixed as if in concrete. I would like to say, moving on from this hectoring and shouting at you all, that the archaeologist should, so to speak, never lose sight of the real goal. And in my view, the real goal is this: it is the accurate and sympathetic understanding of the achievements of the past in terms of daily life, rather than just historical events. Because I think what we should seek to do is to examine how man as a whole, man and woman, I should say, people as a whole have functioned and survived in the mad world in which they've always had to live, and that the rise and fall of dynasties and political events and so forth are important, but they are not the only side of things. And what you would call real life archaeology is paramount. So, as Professor Cherian indicated at the beginning, it's very important for the archaeology that we all do to be subsumed into a greater collaborative world where science and discipline and understanding aids all the participants equally, so to speak. And of course, forensic science, which used to be only for detecting criminals, now has this knock-on effect where all sorts of fantastic work can be done microscopically and so forth in laboratories by people who know that kind of thing. Now, I have an idea about attitudes when you're actually digging. When you are in a room, on a floor, or in a building, or on a site, or excavating, it is important when you are actually working on it to look at the thing, the item, whatever it would be, as a sort of evidence, as an isolated find. So in other words, if you find a pot on a floor, one way of looking at it is the pot. And then the context in which it functioned is in a way separate. And the other way of looking at it is the floor on which it was found and everything else about the room. So that each object should have the dignity of meriting the burning concentration of the observer, as well as being part of a mass. Because if you look at 35 cooking pots on a floor by a cooking arrangement in the Bronze Age, they all have to be cleaned and put together and labeled and put in a museum, because when they're cleaned, they usually wash out the stuff inside the pot. That probably doesn't happen anymore, but it sure happened before in the past, that pots that had grubby stuff in the bottom, we don't want that in the museum, they attract mice, so we'll wash that out, make sure it's nice and clean and all that. And the appraisal of each of these items among a group of items as an individual witness, which is in a witness box that talks to us. The objects should say, look at me, look at me, look at me. You should look at everything, not as an installation or as a collection, but as of the individual things at the same time. So I have a conception that an archaeological object that comes up on a trowel or in the soil, and it's like a spider. If you hold it in your hand, conceptually, it's like a spider, and there are filaments that come out. Half of them are what you would call physical, in other words, the context, the room, the date, the period, all those things that connect to it, its background. The filaments are to do with the physical, but also chronological, because they are contemporary of a period and they have filaments that reach back into their own history. So this is an obvious thing to talk to about archaeologists. But if you find a seal on the floor of a room, a nice seal of a hard stone with a name on it, of course, one of the things that archaeologists jump up and down about is, we can date the level. Marvelous. We have a seal on the floor. So we have a correlation between the pottery and the seal, and how exciting that is. This is a really good thing for our digging. But few archaeologists ever consider that the seal which was found on the floor might itself have been 200 years old when it was last worn by anybody. Because if it was the seal of the great-great-grandfather who, for example, had the same name as the person in question, you would never know that. And the exact dating that it furnishes you could easily be several hundred years out of date without critical appraisal. Now, this is something which I'm afraid this is a bit preaching and yelling at people about stuff, but there are a few things that I want to say because I don't think they're said very often. This is one of them, that if you are an archaeologist and you find something in a time position, in a context, in a stratum, say 1500 BC, then it is really difficult not to think that if it's for example, a painted pot with black diamonds in a funny arrangement, and you call this the black diamond pottery culture, or whatever it would be, and the floor on which it rests is 1500 BC, you kind of have the idea that you've discovered it. So that the fact that this pottery has come to light is due to you being a digger, but also that you've kind of half made the pot. You're kind of big in its history. And therefore, there's a sort of idea that that's when it began. That's when the device, the invention, the design began with the one that you found is at the beginning of its history, because it's at the beginning of its history from our point of view. But everything that ever comes out of the ground had a history beyond its last moment, backwards. So if you marvel over something being 4,000 years old, when you find it on a dig, it was actually much older than that because it wasn't new then. And this framework of adjustment of appraisal is something that a lot of people gloss over. It's pretty obvious with a piece of pottery, but with ideas, it's something else. So, for example, I'm interested in evidence about the mind of the ancient Babylonians, their mind, their thinking processes, their intellect, historically speaking, what they achieved and when. So, for example, the Greeks had a certain level of astronomy, say 500 BC. We know about this from writings in Greek. Well, they also had astronomy in Babylonia. So everybody's happy that tablets from the same sort of date in Mesopotamia as the Greek one, that's okay because they were contemporary and everything like that. But if you posit that the knowledge in a particular Babylonian tablet is actually probably closer to 1200 BC, by inference, people will say, ooh, we don't mind this 500 BC, maybe 550 BC, but 1200? And this kind of assessment is based on a huge fallacy, a huge mountainous, cavernous fallacy, that people are any more intelligent now than they were in the past. They are not. They are not. So any estimate of when it might be appropriate to believe that such and such a population had arrived at such and such an understanding by a hunch when that was going to be plausible, and a hunch that before that's very unlikely, is just nonsense. It is utter unscientific nonsense. We can never understand that. And when you have a tablet written in 750 BC, which shows awareness of eclipses, it doesn't mean that the first time they ever saw an eclipse and wrote about it was in 750 BC, but it doesn't mean that the knowledge probably might go back to 755 BC or 75, but not before that, because we just have a horizon which is a meaningless horizon. There's no evidence about the date of discovery of anything by when you found it. And this is a terribly significant thing, because very often people forget it. They're very good on terminus post quem, when you have a fire which burns the stuff on the floor, and we know it must be before the fire, and so forth. That sort of stuff, fine. But in terms of when in the history of mankind such a thing was plausible, I'll tell you the thing which I really feel strongly about. If you read about the evolution of the human species and Homo sapiens sapiens, and then Homo sapiens, and then the Neanderthals, there's a lot of archaeology about the Neanderthals, who are, so to speak, earlier than Homo sapiens. Lots about where they lived, some of their art, burials, and they had meeting places and all that. And they hunted together, and they had weapons together, and they trapped animals, and they behaved in a very human-like way. I watched something on YouTube the other day where a professor from Cambridge was saying, of course, the Neanderthals didn't have any language. Impossible to have language at that early date, no language in that sort of way. Well, the thing is, the throat of the human being has an arrangement in it whereby language is possible. It has a structure which allows the production of the range of signs where language is possible, and so did the Neanderthals. And it is impossible for me, for anybody, to convince me that Homo sapiens at the beginning, when they all went around going, my name is Ug and your name is Zug, and should we make a fire by rubbing these two things together and see what happens? Just as they had speech, so did the Neanderthals. And yet the official production from Cambridge, in the most pompous way, is, of course they didn't have language. Of course they didn't have. Well, what the hell do you think? How did they operate for 800,000 years against the change of all the temperature and floods and heat and all that? Of course they could communicate. Then they didn't go like that, because when you go like that, before long, when somebody makes a reciprocal noise of a type, you suddenly realize that noises have meaning. And when you realize that noises have meaning, off you go. Then you have Shakespeare. Now, this thing about when stuff begins, I'm going to tell you two small things. In Mesopotamia, my favorite field, the ancient Babylonians like Hammurabi and Nebuchadnezzar and people like that, they believed that you could tell the future by examining the liver of a dead sheep. So the priests, when there was an important decision to be made, opened the body of a sacrificed sheep, took out the liver and examined the surface of it for phenomena like dots, lesions, strange signs. And the experts, the real experts then, knew what these signs meant. They all had a kind of meaning. So from about 1800 BC, the Babylonians, they used this system, and they used it all the way up until the 1st century AD. And it was their principal form of intellectual inquiry about the future. It was one of their essence activities. And you cannot really imagine Babylonian culture without omens, and especially omens from the liver. Now, the interesting thing is that in ancient Iraq, you had two populations who lived side by side. One were the Sumerians and one were the Babylonians. Well, we know about the Sumerians already by about 3200 BC, maybe more. And we know about the Babylonians by about 2900 BC. So in the population between the rivers in the Middle East, the Sumerians were there, and then these Babylonian nomads came into this very fertile land. They moved down south, they settled, and the two cultures, Sumerians and Babylonians, lived side by side, and they had the same writing system, and they had a sort of symbiotic existence. Well, the thing is this, people say that the Sumerians never did this liver omen business. They never tried to tell the future. They didn't sacrifice sheep, take out their liver. They just didn't do it. And they say it's a Babylonian idea. But the thing is, when the Babylonian stuff appears, it is very widespread and extensive. And this is another illustration of a simple claim which won't be substantiated. Because if at 1800 BC you have a flourishing system in all the cities and a universal method of telling the future, say you can find it on the 2nd of March, 1800 BC. Well, in January of the same year, they were sure as hell doing it, and so forth and so forth. Nothing all begins on one day and becomes a universal thing. And when you look at the culture of Mesopotamia, it is impossible to believe that the Babylonians started this overnight in a universal system and it had never been done before in the country. Well, people will say, well, they'll say, there's no Sumerian text about it. Sniff. Sorry, we won't discuss it. The Sumerians didn't have liver divination. But the thing is this. In the wonderful ancient dictionaries where all the words are written down, we discover that there was a word in Sumerian for the diviner who did this operation with the liver. They had their own word for it. Well, if they had their own word for it, why, if they weren't doing it? So this, to me, is an unanswerable problem. The second thing which I would draw to your attention, which may have more vitality in your country too, is there is a tremendous amount of panic about attributing astronomical knowledge to the ancients. Before you know where you are, you either have spaceships, you have Erich von Däniken, you have robots, you have all this nonsense. You don't have to have all this nonsense. The thing is this, it's occurred to me that in ancient Iraq, much like in ancient India, when it got dark at night, when you'd had supper and milk the cows and do whatever you have to do, when it's dark at night, it's dark at night. So if you're in 3000 BC or 2000 BC, people had candles, of course, they had things in their houses. But when you lay on the roof with your head on the back, head behind your, looking up at the sky, there were no factory lights, there were no traffic lights or aeroplanes, there was no pollution. There was the most perfect clarity there, like a drive-in movie. So in antiquity, people who slept up outside, which they sure as hell did in Mesopotamia, and I bet they did in India, when you look at the sky every night, you have a free drive-in movie film, and you end up in the course of a childhood, adolescent, and adult life knowing the night sky very intimately. You can't help it because it's very beautiful and you can see everything. And nobody had bad eyesight because of watching television too long when they were little and had to have thick pebbly glasses or anything of that kind. They all had natural eyesight from living in a kind of natural world and they could see everything. So not only could they see everything, but when you lay there in this way, when things change in the heavens, you would notice. So if something on your birthday was over there on the left and you noticed it 3 months later and all of a sudden it was somewhere over there, you think that's rather strange. And in my opinion, it only wants some intelligent person to think, well, that's rather strange that you have the beginnings of astronomical observation. Because the curious human mind, faced with what you'd expect to be a fixed thing that never changes, in fact is organic and moves and develops, they want to know why. And the Babylonians really did want to know why, and they found out in the most amazing way. But the point is that it's dangerous to say that we can have eclipse omens by the 7th century BC, but not by the 9th and not by the 11th or something like that, when probably the real historical perspective on understanding is very ancient indeed, very ancient indeed. And I think most human things are very ancient indeed. I tell you for why, because there is a force in humanity, in the world, which you can call inertia. It is the natural disposition of the human race to resist change and to be inert. And discovery and invention are contra-instinctive. So this presupposes that human societies run in an unchanging way for endless amounts of time, which of course they do. So this is something to be reckoned with. The populations are not full of Einsteins who suddenly think, oh my God, I've just realized. Sometimes people do, very clever people do. Accidents happen and people think. But in fact, when you look at antiquity, you are dealing with a world which is governed by inertia until you have a violent dominating king and all the rest of that kind of nonsense. But in principle, change is not welcome. Coupled with the fact, also never to be forgotten in antiquity, that people, where they lived in the countryside and wherever they lived in small villages, they had no information about what was going on anywhere. There was no newspapers or anything of this kind. Once in a while, a king's messenger might come into the marketplace and make a statement like, the king is dead, long live the king, maybe, but otherwise you'd have no idea. So the natural tendency for human populations is to be inward looking and not outward looking, apart from those people who traveled around the world in caravan trains as merchants who went from Iraq to Afghanistan looking for lapis lazuli and obsidian, and they had adventures and they traveled everywhere. And it's quite an amazing thing. The network of trade between India, for example, and Mesopotamia, just to pick two destinations out of the air, goes back to very remote times, and more remote times than we know. More remote times than we know, because there were always people driven to explore, driven by cupidity, driven by many other features, individuals who decided to go and see what's beyond the mountains, and then they find something, my goodness me, when they take it home, all the matrons want to have bangles made of it, and then you have the beginning of it. And so you've got the inertia of society at large, you've got a sparky small proportion of people who discover things and invent things, and you've got a sparky small proportion of people who go out to find their fortunes, and all those firework people are a great minority in the great mass. Now, I don't know how many hours I'm allowed to yell at you, but I wanted to make a few more points, if I may, before everybody goes home in disgust. One of the things is that the corollary of this remark that things lie unchanged in the world means that some phenomena in a society can last for millennia, literally millennia, without any basic alteration. And there are different principles which govern this. But for example, if you find a good way to make yogurt and it works, you don't mess around with it, you just carry on making yogurt like that until the end of time. And there are sometimes objects which come to light which indicate a long continuum without interruption. Now this is lovely, and I'm very interested in them, but I'm also interested when you have a chain like that from one end to the other, where the thing at the far end is so closely related to the thing at the beginning end that you can conclude that in between the 3,000 years or whatever it is, this thing continued in use and nobody notices it. In other words, it's under the radar. So if you are a stuffy archaeologist and you have an Egyptian game played in 2800 BC and very popular there for 100 years and then disappears from the archaeological record, then they say it disappears from the archaeological record. If in the Roman period you find a painting on a wall of a tomb of this same very, very ancient game, in the Roman period, 2nd century BC in Egypt, some artist on a tomb has painted this same thing from all that 3,000 years ago, or whatever it is. They say, oh, well, this is hearkening back to the great old days of the empire of the Egyptians, and it's just a kind of nostalgic reference. But that's what Egyptologists say. But you see, there's a third part to this story, that an anthropologist in the Sudan found a version of this game played by Bedouin nomads, the same kind of track, the same game, the same basic game in the 1920s of the AD period. So we have the game in 2800, we have the game in the 2nd century BC, and we have the game in 1920 AD, and nothing in between. But the game is so idiosyncratic, the qualities about it are so diagnostic that there can be no question that this game was played all the way through by people in bus stations, milkmen, I don't know what, guys who go around doing nothing all day. They played this game and nobody wrote anything about it, and we don't find anything because they made holes in the ground. But if you have the two convincing links that you are entitled to assume, even if, like a nice archaeologist, you haven't got a typology ranged through history, one every 12 years, to prove the links. So you have to think. What else did I want? Diddly diddly do. Oh, yes. Dr. Cherin, how much longer have I got? Or has everybody gone home already? Hello?
Hello. You please continue. We are all keenly listening to this wonderful talk.
All right, please carry on then.
Yeah. You please
Lovely.
continue. Yeah.
Okay, lovely. If anybody wants to go and get a sandwich.
Yeah, they can leave. There is no problem. Yeah.
Right. One thing I wanted to talk to you about was the principle of the raindrop and the Niagara Falls, because a thinker, for example, Sherlock Holmes, who's renowned for his intelligent mind and his analytical thinking, espoused this idea, he suggested this idea, that the thinker who sees a raindrop fall, plop on the ground, theoretically should be able to envisage the Niagara Falls, because the influence, obviously, of the force that makes water fall to the ground, if it applies to one, will apply to millions, and therefore they're all the same thing. Now, this seems to me a useful principle, because it means that if you are an archaeologist and you find something, you are entitled to extrapolate from it. In other words, the argument that there's only one is not an argument. My argument is, theoretically and in any application, if you have one, you have the argument. So, for example, in your school textbooks about the archaeology of the world, it will probably tell you that writing began in Mesopotamia in about 3200. Why? Because they had huge temples, they had cities where there was an administrator, there had to be wages for all the people who worked. It was a very complicated social setup, and it was impossible for such a flourishing urban environment to exist without writing. And so that's why writing was first developed in southern Iraq in about 3200 BC. This was what I was told when I was a boy by my professor. Well, not long ago, archaeologists in Turkey excavated, or at least they started to excavate, a site called Göbekli Tepe, Gobekli, Göbekli Tepe. If you've never heard of Göbekli Tepe, Tepe means hill, have a look on the internet and see, because they found the most extraordinary thing: gigantic temples of great complexity with sophisticated art, temples upon temples upon temples, which testify to the most amazing achievements by humanity, and they are 8th millennium BC. So that's 5,000 years before the beginning of writing in Mesopotamia. Now, the thing is, the temples at Göbekli Tepe and the art, the two of them together, have reached in 8000 BC a level of sophistication and central organization and planning certainly equal to the one from southern Iraq, and in some measures even exceeding it. So, if the rule is that that sort of stage, means you have to have writing, I would say we ought to be looking for writing at Göbekli Tepe. Well, this is the 8th millennium BC, 8000 BC and later, and writing doesn't come normally in the world until about 3200. Quite a long gap, sort of gap that people go, I don't think so, I don't think so. Why? because people have said writing began in 3200 BC. Why? Because the first ones that we've got are about 3200 BC, and therefore that's when writing began, because that's the first ones we've got. The same fallacy riddles many, many aspects of archaeology. But the thing is, I was so convinced that at Göbekli Tepe there ought to be some writings that I went onto the Google Images, put in Göbekli Tepe, and looked at the buildings and the temples, the stone temples, the fantastic structures and the sculptures, and this and this and this, and then the small finds, and it went through, and then I nearly fell off my chair, because on about page 17, there were many images on the screen, including a green stone, a green hard stone, a bit like an Egyptian scarab. That's to say, it has a curved back and a flat face, fits in the hand, a bit like a scarab beetle. Now, the thing is, that it was very fine, finished work. The flat face of this green stone was inscribed with 4 characters. Now, the thing is, nobody in Turkey who is a prehistorian, because prehistory, before writing, they don't know about writing because it's pre-writing, prehistory, so they don't even think that it might be writing when they find the only specimen. The person who described it said it was a decorated stone. It was nothing of the kind. It was a seal. It was a seal designed to impress, and it had 4 characters on which wrote either the name of the official or the title of the official or something, but it must absolutely be writing in 8000 BC. One specimen. So if I go to a conference of philologists in my discipline and I give a talk writing in 8000 BC, they will say, oh, well, Finkel is nearly 70 now. You know what happens to scholars in the British Museum when they get to a certain age, they lose their grip, get a bit credulous, get a bit confused. Perhaps we'll just take no notice. But the thing is, I reasoned that according to Mesopotamian thinking, our Mesopotamian thinking, if they had those buildings, they ought to have writing. And then I went and I found a piece of writing, one piece of writing. As far as I'm concerned, this throws over completely, as with a cement mixer, the idea that in southern Iraq in 3200 BC, writing began for the first time. It didn't. It didn't. And all the books are wrong, and they've all believed, because the first ones they find date to 3200 BC, so that's when it started. People say Homo Urukaeus, an Uruk man, invented writing himself in that city, because they found at this stratum the early writing. But you can have early writing, simple writing, that lasts for thousands of years, because if it fulfills its function, there's no need to make it fancy. And this is a crucial point about archaeology in comparison with evolution, that animals on the whole evolve to the point where they can cope with their environment. So many animals are static in their level of achievements. But if you take macaques, for example, it's been shown, and put them on an island where there's no fruit, before long the macaques are cracking over shells on the seashore and eating seafood. So this was a complete new thing that macaques could live off seafood. But they're intelligent, and they evolve brilliantly if they live in the jungle, they have complete control of their environment. You put them in an environment where they have to start all over again, and they do. And this is the point about evolution, that it stops, in my opinion at least, it stops at a comfort level. And it only goes on when it's necessary. And this is the same with phenomena in society. So you could have a very simple kind of writing system that could be used between cities in different countries. This is the sign for these are the numbers, this means good and bad, this is hot and cold, this is red and blue, whatever it is. And you can communicate with these sort of like traffic signals, no smoking and that kind of stuff. It could last for thousands of years until somebody decided, hey, we can do more with this. We can do more with it. But the point is, this argument that I'm shouting at you about is totally revolutionary in my field. It's the sort of thing that might have me stoned to death or burnt at the stake, because it means that all the received dogmatic understanding about this issue is wrong. All of it. That's quite a big thing. Makes me feel nervous. So I wanted to say, I've told you about how dangerous it is to be an archaeologist, how much you might get all sorts of rubbish thrown at you and skepticism and things. But there are 2 points I will conclude with about archaeology and how it can be defended on an intellectual basis, especially when it works in conjunction with history and philology and science, which is, of course, what in the Parma Institute is going to be the case. And we will lead the world in the future in this exemplary fashion of pooling our brains and abilities. There are 2 big things that come out of this. One is the idea that the human race progresses, which is often espoused by clerics and philosophers and thinkers and politicians, that the world is populated by the human race who are improving and evolving rapidly, and therefore at any given moment we, the human race, are the apogee of creation, and everything behind us is inferior, both in the animal kingdom and in our own humble beginnings, is not true. There is no evidence to me of any kind whatsoever that the human race evolves at all. I spend my life reading inscriptions from the 5th century BC, the first millennium BC, 900 to BC onwards, philosophical work, medical, magical, lexical, astronomical, intellectual stuff by intellectual persons, writing on clay tablets in the University of Babylon. I have their document. I speak to these people every day. They're my neighbors, my fellow workers. There's no ounce of brain superiority either in me. I'm not the leading exponent of human intelligence, or anybody else I've ever met that's any different from these people. They are the same as us. They are the same as us. So the Babylonians of the time of Nebuchadnezzar are indistinguishable from us. So if you were on the bus with what turned out to be 2 Babylonians in plain clothes, you got off the bus, you'd nod at them, you might have a cup of coffee with them in the market, nothing about them would strike you. They weren't gorillas or going like that. They spoke the most sophisticated, poetic, clever, elusive, ironic language you could imagine. They are just like us. And when you go back in history, and when you go back into prehistory, they are also exactly like us. There is no wit or development at all in the historic period whatsoever, and probably a very, very long time before that. So if there were any improvement in the human race, don't you think by now we wouldn't have warfare, inequality, cruelty, all the characteristic human things? If we learned from history, if we knew what happened, how fruitless war was, how the stress is unimaginable, and it never produces anything but distress. If anybody learned from history, we might even say we were on the road upwards, but nobody learns from history, least of all the politicians, certainly in our country, because they don't know any history, and they certainly don't have the intellectual abilities to relate them to the modern world, because they think the modern world is uniquely important because they're in charge of it. So it's a kind of folly. And the thing about archaeology is it strips away all this rubbish, because it's to deal with reality, it's to deal with the real life issues of human beings of all kinds, when you can see how they, if you were lucky, how they lived together and how many people lived in the house, and children that died were buried in the wall because the babies died, and you can see when there was privation, and you can see how they compromised and their religious activities, and you have a kinship with them, and you have a real kinship with them. You don't have to be soppy and sentimental about it. And isn't it lovely to speak to people? It's nothing to do with that. What it's to do with is to reinforce the understanding that our modern world, in all its disgusting rubbish, is the direct ancestor, without any getting better, from all that's gone before. And in view of that situation, the more we understand about what has gone before, the better off we are. The better off we are. Secondly, and finally, archaeology, like anthropology and all studies of humanity of the so-called academic, it doesn't have to be academic, it can be poetic, it can be philosophical, whatever it is, all studies of man, in my opinion, show that Homo sapiens, that man has more in common all over the globe, both now and looking backwards, than differences. And there are plenty of differences. Of course, everybody knows about the differences. But underneath that, the inner Homo sapiens thing is shared by everybody. And I think that is a priceless and important matter. So, people today, people in the past were different in beliefs and tradition and language and dress and in 100 external cosmetic ways, perhaps. But inside, we are all one frail species, and the world in which we live today shows that the more we stick together and share our understanding of how to deal with things, the better. And archaeology has not a small role to play in showing what lies in the past and how what we have today is due to what came before. Thank you. Hello?
Yes, sir. Thank you very much, sir. Thank you very much for this inspiring and thought-provoking talk. So, if anybody has any questions, you can put that in the comment. So we will be bringing that the speakers. In fact, so we have a question from Professor Cherian. So
Yes.
the question is that he poses that the sacred spaces of the earlier times have little to do with what we call as temples or mosques or churches over the last 1,000 years. So when you call an 8th century space a temple, is it problematic as it may perpetuate the present idea of temples or their alternatives? So how do you view this?
Well, I think the thing about temples is it does rather depend on the culture. So, for example, in ancient Mesopotamia, where I really work, when people started to live in cities, that's to say a walled city with a central authority of some kind, with collaboration of some kind, and their lives were unfolded, we always find what archaeologists call a temple. Now, there's such a thing in Mesopotamia, certainly from before 3000. You have a complex building, usually with a central cellar, and we know that in their own terms, such a building was the house of the god, because they're called that. The temple of Marduk in Babylon is called the house of Marduk, and the cult statue was in there and visible. So from about 3000 BC, we can not only be sure that they had temples, but they called them temples, as we would too. Now, in the Mesopotamian world, if one is suggesting that they had sacred spaces which were not walled in clay or mud brick or brick, they were open spaces on the bosom of nature where they felt a religious numinous experience or something which wasn't man-made, then that's the sort of thing which I imagine has its roots in the Neanderthal and Homo sapiens first time. I think that's a human idea, and I think they lived in that sort of natural world, and that you have a sort of evolution, if you like, from the sacred space, which is a phase, and the custom-built temple, which is the second phase, and sometimes they exist concurrently and sometimes not. So I think it's a very interesting question, but what little I know about religious open spaces is that they very often have a feeling about them which strikes the visitor, even if they are not necessarily aware of it or looking for it. They are possessed of a certain quality. But I think that same matter would apply in an ancient temple as well, because not everybody could go in there. There were probably not too many lights, and there was a sacred area in front of the god where only the chief of the priests could go, and so forth, and all the mechanics which in a modern religious building create the awe and the sensitivity of it being a holy building also would certainly apply in Mesopotamia, and also in Egypt, of course, where they had temples to the gods labeled as the temples of the god, where they were thought to live. And to support that, many temple rituals were to dress the gods and to feed the gods, and sacrifices were more or less there in order to feed the gods their daily portion of food. So that's a very ancient thing, long before our own world of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. You know, in the appraisal of ancient religion, there is one point which I think is very significant, that in the ancient world of the Babylonians and the Greeks and the Egyptians and the Romans and so forth, there was no religious prejudice. Nobody despised a person from another country because of the bizarre god they worshipped. Nobody was prejudiced against other religions. And in point of fact, in the world where there were many gods in different cultures, sometimes images of gods were sent from one king to another as a gesture of friendship, and sometimes when there was a war, an invasion, they would go to the temple and kidnap the images of the powerful gods and take them home just in case they worked, to have them on their side. And when you have the monotheistic religions, you have this unfortunate idea that my religion is right and everyone else is wrong. And that's caused a lot of trouble in the world. It never existed in antiquity.
Okay, so we have another question from Sonia Das.
Yeah.
So at first she says, even though we are meeting at a digital platform, she
Yes.
can feel the enthusiasm in your voice. So her question is this. So when was the first time and what was the first thing, either it be a monument or artifact, that got you excited and you were in awe?
What a lovely question. Well, the thing is, when I grew up in London, my father was a dental surgeon, and there were 5 children in my family, and it wasn't very far for us to go from our house to the British Museum. So we used to go a lot there on visits. I used to take my brothers and sisters on the bus when we were a bit older, and I always think like this, that in our family we used to go to the British Museum when it wasn't even raining, because very often when it rains, if you work there, you know, the museum goes on around its business, there's members of the public. When it rains, then loads of people suddenly decide the British Museum is a really interesting place because it's free, so you can go in there and you don't get wet. So whenever it pours with rain, there's a huge influx of sudden museum fans. Anyway, I'd spent so much of my childhood in the British Museum, and the thing that really got me was these chess pieces from Scotland. There was in 1831, somebody dug up some ivory chess pieces, and they were carved beautifully, about so big, of kings and queens and horses, and out of walrus ivory in the 12th century. And they're the most wonderful, wonderful chess pieces. And I spent a lot of my childhood with my nose pressed against the glass, gazing at those chessmen. I always wanted to speak to them and so forth. And that's what started me. From then on, I was a kind of British Museum nut. And then I was just lucky that I ended up doing what I do, because I always wanted to read a very difficult language with a difficult writing. And eventually I discovered that cuneiform was definitely the worst. So I ended up doing that. And then I got a job in the British Museum to read cuneiform inscriptions, which is a kind of miracle, because I wanted the most recherche, numerically impossible job in the most recherche, numerically impossible building, and I got it. So that's what happened. But it was those chess pieces. And if anybody ever goes to the British Museum, you have to go and have a look. Oh, I'll tell you something about them if you want to understand that. On YouTube, I gave a talk about those chess pieces, and the reason is that replicas of them were used in the first Harry Potter film. And in the YouTube presentation, we reenacted the scene from Harry Potter just for 2 minutes for fun. So we had a lot of fun. So I strongly recommend having a look at the Lewis chess pieces. They're marvelous.
Thank you, sir. So we have another interesting question, sir.
Yeah.
So why you become an archaeology researcher, and what is your plan to be in your next birth?
My next birth.
Yes.
Right. Well, I'm all in favor of this next birth idea, because I'm in the middle of lots of books, and I've just written a book which is almost completely finished about ghosts, because in the ancient Babylonian world, they knew a lot about ghosts and they believed in them very seriously. And we have all these pieces of magic to make them go away, to make them go back to the underworld, to leave people alone, or sometimes to bring them up to answer a question. So I thought, everybody in the world knows about ghosts, but they don't really know about them. But these are the earliest ones that we can recover from archaeology, all these inscriptions. And in fact, there's even a tablet with a picture of a ghost on it. It's the most amazing thing, written in the 6th century BC. And to get rid of the ghost, you have to make a model of a rather plump, delicious woman. And this woman is supposed to take the ghost off and marry him and go and live in the underworld happily ever after. And they made a ritual like this to get rid of him, and they made a drawing of the ghost on the clay tablet. So I've written a book about that, and it's very nearly done. So that's an exciting thing, because I have a feeling that lots of people say, oh, I don't believe in ghosts, it's just a load of nonsense. But when you ask them carefully at the right time in the middle of the night with a funny noise in the background, then they're not so sure. As for being reborn, what is that noise? Is it a parrot? Is that a parrot?
No, sir. It's some other noises.
Oh, I was rather hoping that there was a parrot at the window saying it wanted to come in and ask a question, like whether the Babylonians had parrots or not. But anyway, I'm all for this next rebirth thing. I quite like to be reborn as a curator in the British Museum in the tablet department. I tell you why. We have about 130,000 pieces of clay with writing on, about 130,000, and I've still got a lot to read. So I think if you can get the chance to be reborn again in the same situation, I would be glad.
Okay. Sir, we have another question.
You're right.
So, how can we change our homes? That means contemporary homes as places of memories, conservation centers of archaeology, inclusive museum concepts. How to get voluntary initiatives of public in archaeology rather than afraid of institutionalist practice of archaeology?
Well, are you talking about, this question is an interesting question, are we talking about having things in one's house which remind you of archaeology, like to say replicas or copies or photographs or pictures, or real objects? I'm not quite sure, because lots of people have real objects in their houses, and it all depends on the circumstances as to whether that's a good idea or not. But I do think that if you have an opportunity as a private individual, not only to see things, say, in a museum on exhibition, but also to handle them and get to know them, this is a very exciting and rewarding thing, because not all ancient objects are important art. And sometimes a pot or a lamp or something which comes to light, which is not going to be of huge archaeological importance, you hold it in your hand and think that the person who lit this lamp lived in the 15th century BC or something. This is quite an interesting experience, and also it doesn't get boring even if you do it all the time. So I think I don't know about the design of houses or anything, but one of the interesting things is in Syria, for example, where I went, where you had a house made of mud brick, they used to have slits in the brick for a breeze to go through the house. So even when it was swelteringly hot outside, the interior was well cooled just by natural purposes. And there are many phenomena about architecture where the ancients understood much more than we do, and they behave much more sensibly than we do.
Okay, sir. The main question in that was how to get voluntary initiatives of public in archaeology, rather than afraid of institutionalized practices of archaeology.
Can you repeat the beginning of the question?
Yes, sir. How to get voluntary initiatives of public in archaeology, rather than they are afraid of institutionalized practices of archaeology.
Well, a good compromise. A good compromise, if a person wants to be a volunteer archaeologist, is to work on an official excavation as a volunteer. Is that what you mean? Because a lot of archaeologists like to employ students, I mean, I don't think they pay them very much, or volunteers to help with the actual work of archaeology. I suppose it will depend on the place, but that is one possibility. I think you can't have a situation that people start digging up sites on their own without any expert at all, because you never know what you're going to find, and it might get destroyed in the process and so forth. So it is always better for volunteers to work somehow under the umbrella of some ongoing archaeological work. Okay.
Hello. Sedu, next question, please, if you want to ask.
Yes, go ahead.
There is a question, what are the artifacts you have behind you in your library? Some archaeology students ask, will you show them to them? They are kids here. Why you place them there? On your left side, there are a few things. Maybe from Indus Valley?
No. This is one of them. This is a Indian chess piece. It is a man on a camel. This is one, and this is a replica of one of the US chess pieces we were talking about. Can you see this? Yes.
Yes.
Okay, yes. That's a chess piece. What else have we got here? Oh. Oh dear. Well, it's mostly books and stupid things. I'm very interested in things that you find in the street, because if you're when you're a child, when you are walking along and you look down, there's often interesting things in the street which just end up there. And I'm always collecting bits of metal. So this is a anchor, and this is a whistle. And I've got lots of things like this that I just found like that. I thought one day it would be fun to have an exhibition about it.
Thank you, sir. There is another question.
Yeah.
So, how do archaeologists validate their findings, ideas, or research to establish their scientific bias and objectivity, methods, and research designs?
How do again?
How do archaeologists validate their findings or researches or ideas to establish their scientific bias and objectivity?
How do they validate them?
Yes.
Well, that's a very deep question. If they are scientific in the narrow sense, if they are the result of laboratory examination, of course, that is relatively straightforward, because the data that comes out of scientific research can usually be calibrated and presented in a way that another scientist will accept. And if they have questions, they can be answered. So scientific research is much easier than what you might call historical or archaeological research, because however certain you are, you always have the problem that you never know what might yet be in the ground. So as I said in my talk, that the only thing to do is, rather than try to validate it, is to try to do your best to present the most cogent use of evidence on the basis of what is already known, what you found out, what can be put together. You make a construction and you offer a thesis, that you always have to acknowledge that at any moment something might come to light which puts a very different light on the matter or shows it to be incorrect, and so forth. So I think with science the path is easier, and if you have historical ideas or archaeological ideas, all you can do is your best at that time. That's the only way forward. It's an important thing to realize. It's a bit like when you do a piece of archaeology, writing, publication, it's a bit like putting a brick in a wall, and the brick has the benefit of supporting the bricks on top, but also it has the problem that if it turns out to be wrong, then some of the wall is going to fall down. That's the way to look at it, I think.
So we have another question on the urbanization of Mesopotamia.
Yeah.
So the question is this: can you please tell us features of urbanization in Mesopotamia and how it was different from the rest of the civilization of that time?
Well, it is certain that ancient man, when they chose where to live, they chose intelligently on the basis of the landscape. So most of the cities that we know from Mesopotamia, that's to say ancient Iraq, are close to or on one or other of the main rivers, the Euphrates or Tigris, because they were very good in Mesopotamia at converting sterile land to very fruitful land by irrigation. They mastered the conception of irrigation in a very scientific sort of way very early on. So we know from the texts where they had to restore these irrigation channels and dig them out regularly, they had a network of canals off the rivers, which was a large, strong body of water with like an artery with veins coming off from it and veins coming off from that, so that they can distribute water widely in the fields, which then became terribly fertile. And that's why Mesopotamia in old school books used to be called the Fertile Crescent. And the land between those two rivers, the Euphrates and the Tigris, they had a surfeit of wheat and barley and produce, which then strengthened their hand for export and trading. So they could produce wool and animal products in abundance, and when they needed tin or things like I said before, from Afghanistan, lapis and so forth, they were able to produce stuff in sufficient quantity for trading purposes. And that affluence and the location where they started off meant that the cities grew from small to big, and people lived in the same place in Mesopotamia for a very long time because the criteria were the same. So if you drive through Syria or Iraq, against the horizon, you will often see a mound which looks a bit like a small mountain, and they're called tell mounds, Tell. And the landscape of the Middle East is covered with, or littered, I should say, with tell mounds, which are the superimposed archaeological material from sometimes many thousands of years of people living in the same place. So when they excavate one of these mounds, the top might be from the Hellenistic period or the Islamic period or the Christian period, but under that it goes all the way back to the beginning of Islam, and then the Hellenistic periods, and then Seleucid, or whatever it will be, all the way down, sometimes to very deep prehistory. Sometimes there can be a deep sounding of extraordinary depth, like a mine, where all these layers are laid out one on top of the other for the archaeologist. So this is a characteristic of settlement in Mesopotamia, that what started out as small became big and then became very big. And another point about the question is that, say, around 2500 BC in Iraq, there were city-states, these types of large settlements, walled cities by the rivers, which were independent one from the other. So they always had a central temple with a central priesthood and one important god who looked after that place. And that was the sort of environment where writing was so necessary. And these cities existed for quite a long time in a state of more or less neutral friendship, but with outbreaks of trouble. And then, like in a textbook case, you have a king arises who conquers all of them and takes over and unites them into what became Mesopotamia. An important king was King Sargon I, who conquered lots of places, brought them under his control, and then instituted kingship, where you'd have still these cities, but with less independence, with a capital city where the king was resident, and where eventually the king's son would become king after him, and so forth. So Mesopotamia is a sort of textbook illustration of that kind of process. Okay.
Sedu, your audio is off.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. So, sir, this will be the second last question for you, sir.
Right.
So, this is regarding the biasness of the written records. So, the question poses as first a statement. The statement goes like this: written records serves as an integral tool for studying colonial encounters, be it as recent as the past 500 years or from proto-historic period. It can never be viewed apart from the bias attached from whatever side it has been written by. So the question is it all right to include those biases in order to understand the history, or should it be ignored completely, or something wider should be looked at, like material culture?
Well, that's a very deep and very interesting question. And I think an answer can be given, because I agree with you that ancient records, like modern records, include bias. In point of fact, all human records, in my opinion, include bias, because accounts written for a readership at any time have a kind of agenda. And it's very transparent in our modern world, but also it applies to ancient inscriptions. So, for example, when the Assyrian kings went to war and they described the ghastly slaughter that they imposed on their wicked neighbors, we hear of 100,000 girls, women prisoners, and jewels and gold, and slaughtering all the men, and burning the cities and salting the earth and everything. And they say 3 of our soldiers got a little bruised. So, in other words, their account of the war is very, very loaded in favor of us and them. Now, since we can see this in ancient texts for ourselves, we can read between the lines.
You also on the video.
Since we can read between the lines, when we study ancient inscriptions, it is not impossible that when we read their testimony, read their accounts of things, we can see that they also had an axe to grind, they had an agenda, and they tell things the way they wanted them to be understood. So it doesn't take a huge amount of imagination when you have an ancient narrative to see what lies underneath it. Sometimes presumably we don't notice it, but I agree that what your questioner asks is a very deep matter, because the use of all documentation, certainly about the expansion of empires, but also all other historical processes where one party accounts for their activity or the general activity to a readership, all of those things have an agenda, and sometimes they have more than one agenda. So if you have a text which is written to exculpate the writer, that's obvious, but at the same time, in the words, there can be other things included which need to be sorted out. And the good historian will, working in this kind of way, test with their mind the words and the resonance of the words, and to see whether you can read between the lines, you can understand. Sometimes we can't. And sometimes there's the process of history helps. So, for example, if you read historical things from the 19th century, then with the passage of time that distances ourselves from those documents, they fall into a kind of sharper perspective. So when you read things which at the time might have seemed to be up to date and useful and helpful, you can see that inside them there's an agenda, there's some other narrative. And the further away one gets, perhaps the sharper and clearer those things are. But I think if your speaker is engaged in such work and thinks in this way, is responsive to this kind of attitude, that will stand them in very good stead as a scholar.
Thank you, sir.
Pleasure.
So the last question in our interactive section is,
yes,
is it a good idea or approach to introduce archaeology basic at school level to develop interest among students?
Yes, I think it is. I think that if you have history or geography on the syllabus and you look at other cultures in the past, then a bit of archaeology is very valuable. I'll tell you something. You know, I was being very rude about the public thinking all we do is look for gold and treasure. But in fact, in answer to this question, I can tell you something else. In Britain, there was a television series on the BBC called Time Team. And it was on television once a week, and a group of archaeologists had one program to excavate some peculiar thing in a field somewhere, dig it and report on it and make sense of it and make a computer reconstruction and publish it all in one program. And obviously they didn't do big undertakings, but say there was a collapsed farmhouse and they wanted to find out when it was first created, or there was some other standing stone and they wanted to know. There were many topics they did once a week, a different one, and they're very lively, and the way they talk was full of interest to all watchers. They had a kind of technique of speaking with such excitement, and their discoveries were so clear, and you were part of it, you were involved in it. Even if you were sitting at home on your sofa, you were on the edge of your sofa with excitement about what was going on. And this had a very big effect on the upswing of public interest in archaeology. And I know this to be true from the following, that many of my friends, colleagues, teach archaeology in universities in Britain, 4 or 5 different archaeological positions. And every year in whenever it is, I don't know, after the exam sometime, they used to interview people who wanted to go to the university to study, to interview the students. And the thing was here that they suddenly found a huge increase in the number of students who wanted to do archaeology, because normally it was a minority subject, a safe subject, and you might have 5 or 6 students a year, but all of a sudden huge numbers were applying. And so the question that you always ask a student who wants to go to a university, why do you want to study this subject? They all said because they watched these television programs and they thought they were marvelous and they were really, really interested. So that was a test case which showed that that sort of thing can be extremely effective. And if teachers object to archaeologists going into classrooms and teaching their pupils about things which are much more interesting than what they're supposed to be doing, another way would be to use television or the internet with that kind of approach, a series of and what we do and how we find out about it. And I think that would collect together quite a lot of interest.
Thank you very much, sir. So I hope we can conclude our discussions. So once again, it was a great pleasure and privilege as always listening to you, sir.
Thank you very much.
On behalf of all the participants, I thank you very much for this inspiring and provoking thoughts.
Thank you.
And I'm sure this is a wonderful start to the PAMA Global Discourse.
Marvelous. And we'll meet next week, all being well.
Yes, sir. So,
lovely.
An eminent cartoonist from our land has drawn a caricature of you. So we will be sending to you that as a tribute for this.
How lovely. How very lovely. Marvelous. Okay. Bye-bye then.
Thank you, sir. So I thank all of the participants who were with us during this session. Hope you all have enjoyed this. And we will be organizing many more talks in this series. In fact, as Dr. Finkel said, we hope he will join with us in addressing the question of why museums, which is the next in the series of PAMA Global Discourse.
Yes.
Thank you, sir.
Okay.
So for the participants, we will be informing all the registered participants about the future events. Details of all the upcoming events and current activities of PAMA can be found in the PAMA website www.pama.org.in and PAMA Facebook page. And we have all the records of these sessions will be uploaded in the PAMA YouTube channel also. So please stay tuned and thank you very much.
Lovely. Okay. Bye-bye then. Bye-bye.
Okay, sir. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.